At 40, Reverend Samuel Carter had built a life founded on faith, trust, and the church. But today, everything felt fragile, as though the very foundation he had spent decades cultivating was crumbling beneath him. His once steadfast conviction was now shadowed by doubt, a gnawing unease that lingered even as he prepared to lead his congregation. Samuel's personal life was a storm of conflicting emotions. He had been married to Jessica, his devoted wife of 10 years, and together they had built a life full of love and mutual respect. But his world had been upended with the unexpected reappearance of Rachel, his college ex-girlfriend, who had come back into his life, stirring unresolved feelings and threatening the stability of his marriage. A secret weighed heavily on Samuel's heart. Hidden in his pocket was a video, one that had the power to destroy everything: his marriage, his ministry, and his faith. As he stood at the pulpit, preparing to speak, his mind raced, knowing that the truth could no longer be kept hidden. If you're hooked by this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. The twists are just beginning. Stay with us as we dive deeper into Samuel's unraveling world. 5 weeks before everything fell apart, Samuel's day began like any other. A quick breakfast, a kiss goodbye to Jessica as she headed out for her shift at the hospital. Watching her car disappear around the corner, Samuel couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Jessica had been different lately, more distant, more withdrawn. It was as if she wasn't fully present anymore, as if a wall had quietly gone up between them. Jessica had always been Samuel's foundation. They'd been married for 10 years, and their life together had felt solid, built on mutual love and respect. She was his partner in every sense of the word, dedicated to her work as a nurse, caring for the community with a devotion that matched her commitment to their marriage. But recently, Samuel had sensed a change in her. She had become more guarded, more preoccupied, and he didn't know why. It was hard to ignore, and the more he tried to push it aside, the more it lingered. The tension gnawed at him all day. As he went about his usual tasks, the weight of it never let up. He tried to shake the feeling, but it wouldn't go away. It wasn't until lunchtime that the first hint of something serious came to light. Samuel had decided to surprise Jessica at work, something he hadn't done in months, but as he approached the nurse's station, he overheard a conversation that stopped him dead in his tracks. "I saw them together again." One voice whispered urgently, "Don't spread rumors." Another voice warned, lowering their tone, "She's the Reverend's wife. Don't say things like that." Samuel froze, the words cutting through the air. They were in that cafe, together, looking too close, too familiar. The first voice insisted. The mention of Jessica's name made his stomach drop. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, but he couldn't ignore it either. The conversation continued, but Samuel didn't stay to hear more. He turned and left the hospital without a word, his lunch forgotten, the unease he'd been trying to ignore now unmistakable. That evening, when Jessica came home, she was the same as always, efficient, busy, polite. But now, with everything running through his mind, Samuel couldn't help but notice the small things. The way she avoided his eyes, the tension in her hands as she moved around the kitchen, and the unnatural cheer in her voice when she asked how his day had gone. It all felt wrong. But instead of confronting her, Samuel stayed silent, unsure of what to say, paralyzed by the fear of what the truth might be. Their dinner was quiet, strained, each word heavier than the last. The trust that had once been the foundation of their relationship now felt like it was slipping away, and Samuel had no idea how to stop it. He didn't know how long things had been this way, or how deep the cracks ran, but one thing was clear: he couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, Samuel sat alone in his office, poring over church bulletins, his mind heavy with everything that had been happening at home. His thoughts kept returning to Jessica's increasing distance, the hushed voices at the hospital, and the gnawing suspicion that something was wrong. He hadn't seen Rachel in years, 15 to be exact. Their relationship had been a passionate one he had thought would last forever before their paths diverged. But life had moved on, and so had they, or so Samuel thought. The knock on the door startled him. He wasn't expecting anyone, especially not at this hour. When he called out, "Come in," his heart skipped a beat as the door creaked open, and there she stood, Rachel, the woman who had once been the center of his world, now standing in the doorway, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. "Hello, Samuel. It's been a long time," Rachel said softly, her voice as warm as he remembered. He stood quickly, the room spinning slightly as he tried to process the sight of her standing there after all these years. Rachel had always been a presence, and now, as he looked at her, Samuel was hit with a rush of nostalgia of memories of their carefree college days, when everything had felt so certain, so full of possibility. They had been young, passionate, and in love. But life had pulled them in different directions, and they had parted ways, amicably enough, but with a sense that their futures were no longer aligned. "Rachel, what are you doing here?" Samuel asked, trying to mask the flood of emotions coursing through him. His mind raced as he processed her unexpected appearance. Rachel smiled, stepping further into the office. "I moved back to the city. I'm working for a law firm here in Harlem. When I heard you were pastoring here, I thought I'd stop by and say hello." Samuel's heart pounded a little faster. "I didn't know you were back in town. It's good to see you." They exchanged pleasantries, the years falling away as they slipped into conversation like no time had passed at all. They talked about their lives, the paths they'd taken, and what had happened since they last saw each other. Rachel listened intently, her eyes never leaving Samuel as she laughed at his jokes, offered thoughtful insights, and shared her own experiences with a warmth that made him feel seen. As the evening wore on, Samuel found himself leaning into her presence more and more, captivated by her attentiveness. She seemed so in tune with him, so effortlessly engaging. The connection between them was undeniable, and even though Samuel knew it wasn't right, he couldn't help but be drawn to her. It felt familiar, comforting even, something he hadn't realized he was missing. They started meeting regularly, catching up under the guise of old friends. Each encounter, though innocent in its beginnings, left Samuel with a mix of exhilaration and guilt. He hadn't meant for this to happen, but each time they met, he found himself anticipating their conversations more and more. Rachel's attention was like a balm for the cracks that were beginning to form in his marriage. She made him feel valued, heard, and appreciated in a way that Jessica, caught up in her own world, hadn't been able to lately. Meanwhile, Jessica's behavior continued to fuel Samuel's suspicions. She was always busy, always distracted, her late nights at work becoming more frequent. Her phone was always close to her, and Samuel couldn't help but notice how she guarded it, even when she wasn't looking. He had asked her about it once, but she brushed him off, claiming it was just work stress. But Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. The tension between them, the lack of trust, the growing distance, it was all taking its toll. And yet, in Rachel's presence, Samuel felt an old spark reignite, one he thought he had buried long ago. But as the weeks went by, the lines between right and wrong started to blur. Samuel had found himself at a crossroads, torn between the woman he'd once loved and the life he had built with Jessica. With every meeting, the pull toward Rachel grew stronger, and Samuel knew that if he wasn't careful, he might find himself crossing a line that he couldn't come back from. Samuel couldn't ignore the growing tension any longer. The doubts, the distance between them. He had to know the truth. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, Samuel finally worked up the courage to ask Jessica the question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. "Jessica, is everything okay between us?" His voice was steady, though his heart raced in his chest. Jessica's hands froze for a moment, the knife and fork in her hands momentarily suspended in midair. Then she lowered them slowly and met his gaze. "Of course, honey. Why would you ask something like that?" Samuel couldn't help but notice the way her eyes avoided his, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. He pressed on, his voice growing more firm. "You've been acting distant lately. You've been working late, always on your phone, and I can't help but feel like you're hiding something from me." That Jessica's demeanor shifted. She sat up straighter and a quick, defensive laugh escaped her lips. "You're imagining things, Samuel. I've just been busy at work. You know how demanding the hospital can be." Her words felt hollow to him, and the sinking feeling in his stomach deepened. He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes, quickly replaced by a calmness that didn't reassure him. Samuel's frustration bubbled to the surface, but something inside him held him back from pushing further. He wanted answers, but a part of him was terrified of what he might discover, especially with Rachel occupying more of his thoughts than he cared to admit. "I just want us to be honest with each other, Jessica," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice from betraying the anger building within him. "If there's something going on, I need to know." That Jessica's expression softened, but there was something almost rehearsed in her response. "There's nothing going on, Samuel. It's just work." "Really? I promise." Samuel stared at her, his mind reeling. The words were there, but his heart refused to believe them. He let the conversation hang in the air, unable to push it any further. But as they sat in silence, he could feel the trust between them cracking, each unanswered question creating a chasm he wasn't sure they could cross. Days passed, and the unease continued to eat at him. The confusion, the anger, it all boiled over one night when he was at the church, sitting in his office, when an unexpected visitor arrived. Dr. Eric Foster, Rachel's ex-husband, stood in the doorway, his expression grim and unreadable. "Reverend Carter," he said with a clipped tone, "I hope I'm not interrupting." Samuel looked up, his heart skipping a beat. He had met Dr. Foster only once, and their brief exchange had left him with an uneasy feeling. The man had always struck him as cold, calculating, nothing like Rachel's warmth. But now, as the doctor stepped into the room, Samuel couldn't help but wonder what he wanted. "Not at all, Dr. Foster. What can I do for you?" Samuel asked, trying to sound more collected than he felt. Dr. Foster didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm sure you're aware that Rachel and I are no longer together," he began, his voice firm. "But I'd advise you to be careful with her." Samuel's brow furrowed in confusion. "Careful? Rachel and I are just catching up. We're old friends. There's nothing more to it." The doctor's eyes narrowed and his voice lowered, filled with something Samuel couldn't quite place. "Rachel has a way of complicating things. She always has. I'd hate to see you fall into something you'll regret." Samuel felt his chest tighten. He wasn't sure what Dr. Foster was implying, but the warning hung heavy in the air. "What are you saying exactly?" Samuel asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Dr. Foster hesitated for a moment, his gaze steely. "Rachel and I had our share of issues, Reverend. She has a past, a way of drawing people in. And when she's done, she leaves them in pieces. I don't want to see that happen to you." With that, Dr. Foster turned and left the office, leaving Samuel standing there, reeling from the cryptic words that echoed in his mind. What was going on? What did he really know about Rachel and her past? The more Samuel thought about it, the more the pieces of his life seemed to be slipping out of his control. The questions about Jessica, about Rachel, were becoming impossible to ignore, and now, with Dr. Foster's warning, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Samuel had reached his breaking point. The secret meetings with Rachel, the growing distance with Jessica, it was all too much. He could no longer stand the tension that had taken root in his life. He needed to put an end to the confusion, to the lies, and confront both women about what had been festering for far too long. That evening, as he sat at his desk in the church office, he prepared himself for the hardest conversation he would ever have with Jessica. He would finally ask the questions that had been weighing on him, demand the truth from her. The burden of doubt and anger had taken its toll, and he needed to know if the woman he had spent over a decade of his life would have betrayed him. Just as he was about to pick up the phone to call her, his cell rang. He glanced at the caller ID. It was Deacon Miles Stewart. "Reverend Carter." Deacon Stewart's voice came through the phone, grim and urgent. "There's something you need to know." Samuel's stomach tightened. "What is it, Deacon?" "There's a video." "Samuel." "A video of Jessica." The deacon paused, as though he couldn't bear to finish his sentence. "A video of her with Dr. Foster. It's circulating among the congregation. It's compromising, and it's already being shared." The words hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. His grip on the phone tightened, his mind racing. He had suspected something for weeks now, but hearing it, knowing it was true, was a crushing blow. His wife, the woman he had promised to love and protect, had not only betrayed him, but now their most private moments were being paraded in front of the very people he had sworn to lead. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The sense of betrayal, the feeling of his entire world collapsing in an instant. It was overwhelming. "Do you have the video?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the deacon replied, the sorrow in his voice evident. "But that's not why I'm calling, Samuel. We need to address this, and fast. People are already talking, and we can't let this fester." Samuel felt a cold rage settle in his bones. The public humiliation of his wife, the scandal that was about to consume them both, it was too much to ignore. He had been betrayed, but the world didn't need to know the details. No, he would control how this unfolded. He would confront Jessica, yes, but not privately. It was time to reveal the truth, to make sure the entire congregation knew what had been happening behind closed doors. "I'll make an announcement," Samuel said, his voice steady, though the storm inside him raged on. "Tomorrow morning at service, I'll address the congregation." "Samuel, you don't have to do this," Deacon Stewart urged, his tone filled with concern. "There's still time to handle this privately. Think about the damage this will cause, not just to your marriage, but to your ministry, your reputation." "I've thought about it," Samuel replied, his voice hardening. "There's no going back now. The truth is out. The people need to know. They deserve to know." The line went silent for a moment, the weight of Samuel's words hanging in the air. He could feel the deacon's hesitation, but deep down, Samuel knew there was no other way. The truth had to come to light, and it would come from him. If his life was going to be shattered, then so be it. He would control the pieces. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Samuel didn't sleep. His thoughts kept racing, each scenario unfolding in his mind. How would Jessica react? What would the congregation think of him? Would they ever look at him the same way again? But the question that plagued him most was one he couldn't shake. How could the woman he had trusted, loved, and built a life would do something so cruel? As dawn broke, Samuel stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. The man who looked back at him was a stranger. He was no longer the proud, devoted minister he had once been. In this moment, he was someone else, someone desperate, broken, determined to expose a betrayal that had stolen his peace. When the time came, Samuel stood behind the pulpit, his hands gripping the edges tightly. His heart raced in his chest, but his mind was resolute. The congregation filled the pews, their faces expectant, unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. "Today, we will talk about truth," Samuel began, his voice carrying across the sanctuary, "about how the truth, no matter how painful, must always come to light." His eyes swept over the congregation, resting for a brief moment on Jessica, sitting in the front row. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped her purse, and he knew that she knew what was coming. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then with one swift motion pressed a button. The screen behind him flickered to life, and the image of Jessica with Dr. Foster appeared for all to see. The room fell into a stunned silence as the video played, the betrayal now exposed for everyone to witness. Samuel stood still, his heart pounding, but a cold satisfaction settled over him. This was his moment, the moment he had prepared for. Let them see the truth. Let them judge. What else did he have to lose? The chaos that followed was immediate. Gasps filled the room as the congregation processed what they had just witnessed. Jessica stood up, her face a mask of shock and shame, and rushed out of the church. Dr. Foster, too, slipped away in the confusion, his reputation destroyed along with Samuel's marriage. The intimacy between them was clear, too clear for anyone to deny. Gasps echoed through the room, faces filled with shock, disbelief, and confusion as the video played. Samuel stood still, his expression hard, his eyes locked on the screen. He was no longer the man they had known, the man they had trusted. In this moment, he was someone else, a man who had been wronged, a man who wanted nothing more than to expose the betrayal that had broken him. The chaos in the church was immediate. Whispers turned into shouts as people stood up, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Jessica, her face pale and stricken, jumped to her feet, her body trembling. She backed away from the pew, but it was too late. The damage was done. The truth was out, and there was no hiding it. Without a word, she fled, pushing past those in her path, the air in the church thick with the sound of people murmuring, questioning, and pointing fingers. Her exit was swift, but it could not erase the betrayal that had just been exposed for all to see. In the back of the church, Dr. Foster's reputation crumbled as the whispers reached him. His face drained of color as the realization hit him the same video that had shattered Samuel's life was now destroying his own. As the room descended into chaos, Dr. Foster slipped out unnoticed, his own path of escape a quiet acknowledgement of the destruction his actions had caused. But Samuel remained standing at the pulpit, watching the scene unfold, a cold, grim satisfaction filling him. This was his reckoning. The truth was out. The world now knew. But in that moment, as the room erupted around him, Samuel felt something shift inside him, a hollow emptiness. The revenge he had longed for, the exposure he had hoped would bring him peace, had only left him feeling more broken than ever. The church, once a sanctuary, had become a place of devastation. And as the chaos continued, Samuel realized that the storm he had unleashed would be far more destructive than he ever could have imagined. The fallout from Samuel's actions was swift and unforgiving. The video, now infamous, spread like wildfire through the community, its reach extending far beyond the church. Jessica, her face masked with shame, packed her things and moved out of their home. Within days, she filed for divorce, citing Samuel's public humiliation as grounds for the dissolution of their marriage. She sought refuge with her family, the woman who had once stood beside him, now an unapproachable stranger, Doctor. Foster's world crumbled just as quickly. The video's revelation cost him his job at the hospital, his reputation shattered beyond repair. The board, unable to ignore the scandal, demanded his resignation. His life, once defined by prestige, had become a cautionary tale of broken trust and ruined careers. Samuel's own life fell apart in ways he hadn't anticipated. The church, once his home, expelled him without hesitation. The congregation, shocked and betrayed, turned their backs on him. Deacon Miles Stewart, the man who had once supported him, now led the charge for his removal, pushing Samuel to the edges of the community he had served for so long. With no church, no marriage, and no purpose, Samuel was left with nothing. His faith, once so sure, had crumbled under the weight of his own actions. The very foundation that had supported him, his marriage, his ministry, was gone, leaving him in a sea of isolation and despair. Even Vanessa, who had been his ally in the dark moments before, distanced herself. She, too, seemed to realize the destructive force they had unleashed. She no longer reached out, no longer shared his burden. Samuel was alone in his misery, facing the full consequences of his choices with no one left to turn to. Exiled from the life he had built, Samuel was forced to confront the wreckage of everything he had once believed in. The path ahead was uncertain, his future shrouded in darkness, and every step he took felt heavier than the last. Months passed, and Samuel found himself weighed down by the full extent of his actions. The isolation was suffocating, each day a reminder of everything he had lost. But just when he thought the darkness would consume him, a small light appeared. Deacon Stewart, the one person who had once looked at him with trust, came to visit. He sat with Samuel, not in judgment, but with compassion, reminding him that while he couldn't erase the past, he still had the power to move forward. This moment, though brief, sparked something within Samuel. He realized that redemption wasn't about undoing the damage, it was about learning from it, acknowledging his mistakes, and finding the strength to rebuild. And so, he began again, taking small steps toward healing and redemption. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. Your support means everything as we dive deeper into these journeys of struggle and redemption.